right. So we were talking about brooding and like setup. And I talked about how at the beginning, when I first hatched chicks 20 years ago, I had a cardboard box with a heat lamp over top of them. And I left them like that over the weekend in my classroom when I was a teacher. And I just think back now, like how many times I could have burned down the school and how I've kind of changed my ways. So I was just kind of going over quick setup, brooder, safe, secure. And then I said a square foot per chick is my preference, if not more. And you have to think about, those little teeny chicks are going to fit in anything. But once they're big, I leave mine in there until they're about 6 weeks old. And then I want them to be able to fit nicely when they're older too. Um, Heat, I said I don't use a heat lamp anymore. I do use a brooder plate and I keep them in my house for the first 2 weeks until they're a little bit stronger. And then I'll move them to my garage as long as it's like at least 50 degrees at night. I'm not putting them out there when it's 30. Right now in Ohio, it's pretty cold. So I kept my chicks in my house a little bit longer. But anyway, that's where we're at. And I have a list of questions that people asked in the stories.
Yeah, let's go ahead. We can knock those questions out and then drop little comments in between.
Cool. So heat lamp first plate was the first question that popped up a lot. I don't use a heat lamp anymore because of the fire hazard, and I feel like it's harder to regulate temperature. I use a brooder plate. They go under when they're cold. They come out when they're not. I keep it nice and low, so they have to duck to go underneath it. And like I said, I keep it in my house for the first 2 weeks. So if you're putting chicks outside early on, a brooder plate's probably not going to keep them warm enough, which I think is why a lot of hatcheries will tell you, don't use a brooder plate, use a heat lamp, because it is a little bit more risky if you're just putting them out somewhere cold. So um, the brooder plate also I feel like is more a natural heat. When I raise chicks with like mother hens, the chicks, even in winter, will go under her when they're cold and they'll come out when they're, exploring and eating and things like that. So it is pretty cool to see if you've never had a mother hen raise chicks before. She does a really good job of providing that heat as they need it. And I feel like they acclimate to the outside temperatures way quicker than when I used to use a heat lamp.
Versus better. I guess the one thing I would say about the heat lamp is that it like distributes the heat, right? So the chicks can find, that sweet spot where it is, that best suits them. And again, obviously you have to take in mind the safety component of it too and make sure it's very secure if you're going to use it. So me personally, like as a kid growing up raising broilers for 4-H and whatnot, that was the only thing we did. So I have never had an issue, and I see those terrible stories, where something does happen and, there's fires. Obviously there's risk involved there, but if managed appropriately, they can be good too, especially on the outside, like you mentioned.
A couple of years ago, I put in my stories like, hey, if you've had a heat lamp fire, like send me some pictures. And, if you're okay with me sharing them. And I put them, there's a story highlight on my main page called Heat Lamps. And just like the amount of stories that came in with like garages and barns and kitchens and everything burning down from heat lamps, I feel like, yes, you can secure them. I've never had a fire at my house with heat lamps when I used to use them, but I feel like the average person just getting started with chickens doesn't see that potential for super danger.
Sure.
And so it is like important, I think, to point that out. It is a fire hazard. The brooder plates are a hazard as far as like don't put them in the cold, don't have any draft on them. So you got to be careful both ways. But
Sure. And there's some new ones out there too, the heat lamps, and obviously technology's come a long way, but if they fall over, they automatically cut off. So that's one thing to look into that are much more safe than the old traditional, regular heat lamp. So
yeah, for sure, for sure. Okay, the next question I got a lot of was water supplements and what to feed your chickens. So, do you supplement their water when they're babies? What are you putting in it? How long are you doing it? And people were asking questions like, should I put poultry cell in the water? Electrolytes, probiotics, like what should I do? So I'll let you talk on that if you want.
yeah, so I'll give you my experience. I don't use them. I really don't find a need for it. Yeah, in very stressful situations, the vitamins, electrolytes probably aren't going to hurt you. One, you want to make sure they're drinking. But again, if they're sick and not doing well, they're not drinking very much. So adding those electrolytes can kind of put extra pressure on the kidneys. So one of the reasons we may want to avoid those. Probiotics aren't a bad thing. You've got to imagine the chick's GI tract is pretty much, it's not sterile completely, but starting it off with a good lactobacillus or good probiotic early isn't going to hurt as well. So that kind of gives it a little jump start. Something good to think about. One thing I've recommended too, and you've got to kind of weigh this both ways, is that if you've got a really healthy flock that you could introduce, maybe not like on day one, but a couple days in, some of the some of the droppings or some of the bedding material from your older birds in there. So kind of that's a good sort of prebiotic, a natural prebiotic that exposes your baby chicks to what they're going to, come into as they expand off into the rest of your flock. So yeah, as far as electrolytes, not necessary. I know that's kind of one everybody goes to because it's something I feel like, that's the one thing most backyard keepers have access to that they can give and they feel like they're going to do positive with it. Again, probably not a negative, but not necessarily 100% required ever. And then feed, and just a chick starter feed. And some people want to go like organic, right? So that would mean that you're not going to feed a medicated feed, right? And if you're feeding a non-medicated chick starter, you need to consider coccidiosis and how you're going to approach that, which really means probably like a coccidiosis vaccine, which gives them a really small dose of live coccidia and that they develop immunity to that over time. And for that vaccine to work, they need access to their droppings, right? So the vaccine cycles in their GI tract, and about 7 days later, they kind of excrete the first eggs from the vaccine. So those are, we call vaccinal oocysts or vaccinal eggs. And they pick those up, and then it starts that cycle over again. So that cycle of coccidia, the life cycle, takes about 7 days. And they need about 3 full cycles in order to develop that immunity. So something to keep in mind too, if you're going to be in that organic program, non-medicated feed, having a controlled exposure to coccidia is important so that they develop that immunity. So when they do get mixed in with the rest of the flock, that they do have some immunity built up to coccidia.
So when I have people ask me medicated or non-medicated, I always say, like, if you're a beginner and this is your first time with chicks, if your chicks are not vaccinated for coccidiosis, I always suggest doing a medicated feed for the first few weeks, because I feel like until you get a handle on chickens and, their poop load and cleaning the brooder and keeping their water clean and all that kind of stuff, I don't use medicated anymore. And in the place I, usually get my chicks from are not vaccinated, but I've never had an issue with coccidiosis just because this is my full-time job. I'm cleaning the brooder often. I'm keeping things clean. Their water is changed and washed every day. But I always say, like, if you're a first-time person doing this, you might want to start with medicated. And what's your thoughts on people that are saying, I only want to do organic with my chickens? Like, is that really going to affect their eggs 20 weeks from now if they do medicated for the first few weeks?
No, it's not. I mean, it's definitely an insurance policy, right, for coccidia is to feed that medicated feed. It's amprolium, so like 99% of the feeds probably almost every feed that you're going to buy in a retail setting is going to have medicated feed will have amprolium in it as the anti-coccidial. And there's a small enough dose in there where it does allow that cycling, and so they do build up immunity. It's a little slower, which is fine, but it will help in terms of preventing challenges with coccidia down the road, especially when they're baby chicks. So it's definitely the easier way to go. If you're really wanting to do that medicated organic program, it's going to require a little bit more management in how to manage coccidia, whether it be a vaccine or just slow exposure, and be prepared that if you do start to see those fluffed up chicks, usually we start to see those at around 3 weeks. It can occur earlier if they've got a bigger challenge, but just be prepared that you may need to supplement or give water that has has chorid in it or amprolium to control or kind of knock down the coccidia.
Yeah. While we're talking about vaccines, I know someone commented about what about Marek's vaccine? Most of the hatcheries I've worked with offer the Marek's vaccine, and it used to be something I just didn't do back before I knew about it. And now seeing all the effects of Marek's disease and how, like, you can help prevent it with a vaccine, I do get my chickens vaccinated for that. But I would love to hear your thoughts on that vaccine and anything else you think chicken keepers that just have a backyard flock should be getting.
Yes, I mean, Marek's is definitely one, right? It's been around for a very long time. It's a staple. If we look at industry birds, they're definitely going to be exposed to Marek's. If you're in a poultry environment, to think that it's not going to happen to you it's going to happen. I mean, it floats on dust, right? The virus is excreted from dander, from feather dust, and so it's just in the air. It can travel forever, and it can live. That virus can be active for years in the environment, so they will be exposed. You go to Tractor Supply or wherever and you pick up your chicks, the possibility of somebody else being in there, just you pick it up on your feet and walk it in. So it will happen. Marek's is definitely one that you want to protect your birds for, because it's going to give you years potentially of protection. So once they have that vaccine, it's not like they need a booster or whatever. It's going to be with them forever. So definitely an important one, an easy one to give. The one that if you're going to give it at home, there is and I've done multiple videos on this or talked about it multiple times, is there's the lyophilized version, which is the one you can buy from, Valley Vet or retail, wherever you want to buy it from. And it's what we call a cell-free vaccine. And so you get a little bottle that's got a lyophilized or frozen freeze-dried pellet in the bottom, and then you get a bottle of diluent. The smaller one is 200 mils. And so you use that diluent to rehydrate the pellet, and then you put that pellet, the kind of rehydrated version, back into the bigger bottle. So that gives you like the 1x dose. If we look at the data around that and how it was, and we won't get into all the details, but basically it doesn't provide very good protection, because when we just inject straight virus, vaccine virus in this case, into the baby chick, that baby chick has antibodies to Marek's that came from its mom. And we'll get into that too, like those antibodies coming from the yolk. That's another one we need to touch on. But what happens is the vaccine virus is basically inactivated by those antibodies that come from mom, or it's significantly reduced, like the ability for it to protect. And I went back and did a bunch of research in the data. We found that the data tells us that if we give about a 5x dose of that vaccine, that you can really overcome the amount of circulating antibodies and get much better protection that's more equivalent to what's used like in the industry more commercially, which is a cell-associated vaccine. So you may have heard me talk about this. The vaccines that are standard, used everywhere commercially, are actually the vaccine virus is inside a living cell. Okay, and the way that works is if we inject that living cell into the chicken, now it's the virus is protected inside a chicken alive cell. It's called a fibroblast. And what happens is that chicken cell attaches to normal tissue in the chicken. And then the virus kind of makes its way from that living cell into the rest of the living cell. So it's like a little protective cocoon that the virus lives in, and it's not affected by those antibodies. So that's the common one that's used globally and provides very good protection. So if we're going to give that lyophilized one, the one you can give at home, we're going to give a 5x dose of that. And the easiest way to do that is when you have your 200 ml bottle of diluent, pull out 80% of it. So pull out 80 mils of that, 160 mils of that. And so you're left with just 20% in that bottle. So throw the 80% of it away, and you've got 20% of the fluid left in the diluent bottle. Now hydrate your vaccine in that. That gives you a 5x dose, and then you follow the label basically at that point. I think it's like 0.25 mils or 0.2 mils is the actual dose.
Okay, that's good to know, because that's the one that I use, the one from Valley Vet. And I was just following directions like that. I saw them out there on the internet. Somebody asked, someone said, I realized that farm supply store chicks are not vaccinated, and that is usually the case that I've seen too. If you go to like your local farm supply store and get chicks there, they usually are unvaccinated for anything. So check with them for sure. And honestly, sometimes the employees don't know, so you have to like do some research on your own sometimes. And then talking about Marek's vaccine, if you're hatching chicks on your own or you're buying chicks and you want to vaccinate them, correct me if I'm wrong, it has to be done pretty early on, right?
Yeah, it needs to be done at day of age, because what we want is the vaccine to be the first introduction to Marek's, right? If they're exposed to the wild type vaccine first, or the wild type virus, that basically takes a hold first, and the vaccine doesn't really provide any protection. So if we're giving it, a week later, the likelihood of it providing that protection we want is not going to be very good. So day of age, as soon as possible, basically, once they come out of the brooder or incubator and they're ready to go and fluffed up, that's when we want to give it.
Okay, good to know. Okay, so let me see what else we had on here. Do you have any other? Oh, let's talk about illnesses that chicks can get while they're in the brooder. Like, are there things people should be worried about, like brooder pneumonia, things like that? Somebody keeps asking about grit too, switching from stage 1 grit to stage 2 grit. Most companies that sell grit, it'll say on the bag what to do. So I think it depends on where you're getting it, because all the grit I've seen is like different sizes depending on the company. So I would look at that. But I'm giving chick grit to my chicks, because I'm feeding them a mash or they're eating other things other than their crumble. I'll switch to the like adult size grit once they're out in the coop with everybody else. That's my
if you're feeding a standard crumble, that feed has already been basically pulverized. It goes through a hammer mill, and it's to a point where chicks can easily digest it. So if you're giving grit, it's essentially just taking up space for feed. So I wouldn't recommend grit unless you're on, they're eating grain or something that actually needs to be broken down. Grit at that stage is not really important. And so we really want to get as much feed in there as possible. If we're giving grit, it basically takes up space for feed. I did want to mention that too real quick, is that in that first 24 hours, that's something that you really want to check on, is that excuse me, that every chick is eating. And so what we do is call a 24-hour crop fill. So your chicks are out, they've come out of the hatcher, and they've had access to feed for a day. It's easy to just take every little chick, and you can feel inside their crop. It's usually about the size of a nickel or so. That ensures, if you can feel that in there, they've been eating, they're off to a good start. If they're not, and if that crop is empty, or sometimes you'll feel just a little bit of water in there, we may want to intervene and make sure, give them a little extra support they need to get that feed in them, because that's important. And it's what I wanted to mention earlier, is that in the late stages of incubation, the yolk is actually pulled into the abdomen, and the abdomen closes, and that yolk is full of those maternal antibodies we talked earlier, right? So it's really important that that chick absorb all that yolk, and what starts that, kind of initiates that process, is chicks going on feed. So once they go on feed, it's kind of a stimulation for them to take in that yolk, which takes in antibodies and energy and all the other things. If they don't get on feed right away, that's sort of like, okay, well, I need to hang on to this yolk as long as possible, because it's essentially like a gas tank, right? It's their fuel tank. Chicks can actually go several days without eating or drinking, just living off of that yolk inside them. It's sort of like, Mother Nature's way of kind of giving them something they need if they didn't have all the resources in front of them when they hatch. So again, we want to get them on feed right away, make sure they get all that yolk absorbed, and that's going to help them, protect them from those potential diseases that they could see early on. In regards to specific diseases that they could see in the, in the brooder, really, it's a pretty sterile environment, ideally, right? You don't want to introduce a lot of things, especially, I talked about bringing that litter in there for good stuff. Obviously, if you've got a sick flock, you don't want to do that. But for the most part, most chicks aren't going to be vaccinated for bronchitis. That's something that, again, is a commercial thing. We can see a little bit of vaccine reaction from that. They get a little snick. That's normal. Birds get over it. They're going to build a immunity to it. Ammonia in a backyard setting shouldn't be very high, because, right, we're managing moisture and things like that. You need moisture to produce ammonia. Usually that's not a problem. And dust, they're not really, kicking up too much dust at that age either. So usually, unless they're getting something vertically transmitted, remember, mycoplasma is one thing I talk about a lot. That's a vertically transmitted disease. It usually doesn't affect them in that first week or two. It's once they get out and they're more stressed. But typically, specific diseases in the brooder are pretty rare. They can pop up, but it's going to be those that came from mom, typically.
Yeah. As far as so if you're ordering hatching eggs from somewhere that you're not too sure if they're a clean place or whatever, can those things the viruses and stuff stay on the outside of the shell and then expose the chicks once they are hatched?
They can. So Cocci is another one, right? We'll have chicks in a brooder, and it's brand new bedding. It's fresh water, like you're saying, keeping everything clean, and then they break with coccidia. Those little tiny eggs, oocysts, can be on the eggshell, and when you're hatching them out, they're pecking around in the incubator or in the hatcher, and they can be exposed that way. So yeah, there are things that they can be exposed to, but for the most part, and I'll back up a little bit too. A lot of people want to clean eggs before they go, and this is probably one of the bigger issues we can have with chicks and disease early on, is washing eggs prior to putting them in the incubator. That's a really big no-no, because you break that cuticle. The cuticle is like the natural defense to keep bacteria out of the egg. If we wash the egg, or you'll see recommendations on using fine grit sandpaper or a scrub pad or whatever. That's really a big no-no. Once number one, that pad gets contaminated. So, right, you scrub off the first piece of little manure, and then you use that same pad. Now that pad's contaminated. You're going to basically break the cuticle, and you're rubbing bacteria into that eggshell. That bacteria then translocates through the shell into the egg, and now you've contaminated those embryos, and they may still hatch, but they're going to be potentially, they have a yolk sac infection or yolk infection. And that's really the biggest issue that we have with chicks early on, is that they have these naval infections or yolk sac infections that are really, really hard to get over.
Yeah. Yeah. Somebody asked about, can you tell us again the amount of stool to introduce to the brooder from your healthy flock, and maybe what age to do that?
Yeah, I'd say, again, if we're Marek's is the one that you're gonna introduce, right? If you do that, so they're going to be exposed to it within a couple weeks. But if we're vaccinating for chicks, I give them like 7 days to have that vaccine really take root and protect. If you read the literature, it says 14, but the amount of protection the Marek's vaccine gives the bird, that 1 to 7 is like a really ramped up. They've got really great protection at 7 days. The amount of extra protection you get from 7 to 14 is probably minimal. But introducing that, say around a week or so, and I say about a cup. It's not like so much per bird. It's just enough to get a little bit of material in there, that mom's droppings and the flock's droppings in there, so they can kind of become exposed to what's going on.
What would you say? Maybe this is going to be controversial, but what do you say to the people who refuse to give a vaccine to their chicks because they want to, like, they are leading a more natural lifestyle and they don't want to do any vaccination for their chicks? Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'll go back to Marek's is a very proven safe vaccine, and Marek's disease is a very well-known. I mean, it affects birds, and it doesn't affect them all the same way. I'll read, posts about, my flock broke with Marek's. That's not how Marek's works. It's sort of random. So you may have you get, let's say, 20 chicks and you brood those and you don't have the vaccine. They're not all going to break with Marek's at the same time. So you may have one 8 months later that starts to show signs. And that doesn't mean they're all going to show, right? So one may be a year and a half later. It just really depends on how that particular bird is affected by the virus, and could be stressed out more so, and the virus affects it earlier. So always recommend Marek's. If you're not going to vaccinate for Marek's, just know that it's going to be a potential that you could have. And Marek's is actually a immunosuppressive virus. So most of the time, the disease that comes from Marek's, or the actual disease it causes, is immune suppression, and birds just get sick, right? It's not the classic paralysis or wing drop. That's the sign that everybody sees, or the clinical sign that everybody associates with Marek's. But most birds succumb to Marek's from secondary bacterial infections or viral infections that we don't ever really say, oh, that was Marek's.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it's one of those things that once your flock, if it's like present in your flock, it's like, it's going to be there, right? Like, you're not going to get rid of all the dust particles.
No, you can't clean your way out. You can't disinfect dirt, right? So, and it's in the ground.
Okay. I don't want to keep you too long because I know you have an engagement to go to today. A lot of people were asking about when to integrate chicks, how to integrate chicks, and I'll give my take on this first, if you don't mind. I have integrated lots and lots and lots of chickens into the flock. I've seen people say, wait until they're older, wait until they're the same size as the hens, and then integrate them so they can like hold their own. I view it the other way. I integrate my chicks early on, like 6 weeks old. And I find that as long as you do it safely, where you're, putting them in a safe environment so that other chickens can't get to them, but they can get used to them. I find that those little ones kind of take their place in the pecking order, and they're just like, okay, fine, I will not fight back. You win, you're in charge. And then there's no fighting, there's no squabbling for me. And my flock's kind of used to that too. So I think that's helpful. But if it's as soon as I put in a chicken who's like a pullet, who's a little bit older, my flock will do a lot more like showing off and attacking them through the cage and stuff like that. But I find that when they're younger, I like that way better. People do it different ways. Some people will just throw them on the roost and when it's dark and be like, good luck. And that works for some people. I don't. My chickens are my pets, so I don't want anybody getting hurt. So I don't do it that way. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just you approach this one individually on your own, how your birds are going to react to them. I think having a place for, that's small, like, or short, so they can get under if they need to get away versus, the larger birds can't get to them. That's something you may want to consider as well. But really, I think you have to approach each one of these based on how your birds are going to react, what they've done in the past. And I think one thing to mention here too is, a kind of all in, all out setting. We talk about that. So keeping a closed flock. And I know this doesn't apply to most backyard keepers, but really if we want to manage disease really well, it's the best thing you can do is all in. So you raise a flock up, those birds, come of age, and then we move those out, and ideally we would have downtime, and then we start the flock over again. So I just want to put that in there, and I know it probably doesn't apply to people, but if we really want to do a great job of managing disease, that's really the best way to do it.
Helen says, what about introducing a day-old chick to a 1-year-old hens? And I don't think you can do that unless you have. I like to do like adoption, where if I have a broody hen who's been broody for a few weeks, I'll slip. And I know you're going to say, well, that's introducing disease, but I'm doing it anyway because it's too cute.
Yeah.
Putting that chick under the broody hen at night. Hopefully she takes to it, and then she handles the chick from there. But you can't just integrate a 1-day-old chick into a flock of hens. They will kill it. Like that. That's just how that will end. Unless you are keeping it in. First of all, don't just introduce one chick. That's not nice for that one chick. But you can keep it in like a cage that has a heat source in it. But even then, they're pretty little, I think, to be exposing them to the big chickens. 1-day-old is pretty little.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so one thing to remember too is you mentioned the heat source. That's really important. So chicks can't manage their own temperature, so they're called poikilothermic. I'm going to mess that word up, but basically that means they have to have heat. Like they have to have external heat till about 10 to 14 days old, and that's when they can start generating their own heat. They can kind of step out from the heat source and be kind of on their own. They've got some feather development already. So if we're going to introduce those chicks to the flock, you really need to be past that point where they're on their own and they can actually generate their own heat and they can survive on their own. So always keep that one in mind. I agree with you. Doing it at a day of age is not good because it's not going to have that heat source or a good access to it.
Yeah, for sure, especially if they're out in a coop. Okay, so I'm gonna end this live here today because I know the Poultry Doc has somewhere to be. My parents' pool house is flooding, so I'm gonna go help mop up water. But we're both gonna come back on here later today and check out comments and questions, and we'll be answering those, throughout the next few days. So please, if you didn't get your question answered, put it in the comments and we will come back and do that. And we come on live once a month, usually at the beginning of the month. We try to aim for around the 1st. We talk about a new topic on chickens. I'm a backyard chicken keeper with lots of experience doing it as not a poultry vet, and the poultry vet has tons of experience doing it his way with his medical background. So we come together, try to make chicken keeping easier for everybody. And if you have questions, put them in there and we will come back to them.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for joining. And I'll also post by the end of the day, I should have up, I've got an article about brooding and some of those things we talked about today, probably even more because it was a pretty short episode. But yeah, check that out. I'll have a link and I'll post it on yours too, Nikki. So
that'd be great.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, everybody, thanks for joining, and we'll see you next month.
Bye.
Bye.